One. Okay, we are live. I'm Christopher. Welcome. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Duncan.
Duncan, you first.
that was my introduction. Sorry. Next person.
All right. I'm Jordan. I'm an undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill.
Hi, my name is Brielle. I am a PhD student at UNC Chapel Hill. I just got my master's degree and I do work and research mostly in ethics.
Okay, so today's topic is rather nebulous. It's more of a question, and it's the question of how should we die? And I suppose we can partition it categorically into three segments at least of relevancy. The first being, what is death? What are its applicable properties, which we'll kind of poke a stick at and almost make an implicit concession that we're not sure. The second being, insofar as how is concerned, how would you like to die, so to speak, meaning the experiential components. And the third being the ethical implication of how should we die insofar as an ethical theory would be concerned. So I guess we'll begin by diving into a question of what do you guys think are, rather than asking you to define death in its entirety, what do you think are a subset of the properties associated with death?
Well, I've heard of something called the three deaths before, and I have no idea where I heard it from, but it was talking about how one dies in a physical sense, and then but also one's legacy is known. So those people who know you personally, once they all die, that's a second death. And then once basically no one ever mentions you ever again, that's the final death sort of things. I feel that that's a little bit more of a interesting look at the death thing as opposed to just a physical death. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar to that. Like that's the most broad place to start, the legacy versus the physical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think even within the physical realm, there's still lots of question about what counts as death. I don't really have many thoughts on the whole being remembered thing, although I do have, I guess, some moral questions about that, but I guess that comes later. But even within the physical realm, it's like, there are like, there's vegetative states, there are people in comas, people who are on life support. And it seems like different people, depending on their goals. So whether you are a doctor or a psychologist or even a philosopher, you might have a different definition of what it means just to die in the physical sense.
That's true. That's a great point. Is a person in a vegetative, like at what point would we consider a person essentially dead? So I guess maybe we could ask the question, like, if we're referring to a subset of all classifications of death, maybe we should the ability to have a conscious experience be a factor in the type or the way that we are discussing death? Meaning, if we presuppose a person is just in a vegetative state, they will never again have a thought, is that person dead? I guess, what is dying? Is it the cells or is it the person?
It seems to me like dying is, you guys are talking about the intermediary state of like the vegetative thing. I would say death is when you can't come back physically. Like in a physical sense, you cannot come back. Because there's people in comas who aren't dead. Some people come out of comas, So there's this, there's the intermediary, but we classify death usually as like cannot come back physically from this point.
Yeah. When it comes to the physical, I actually am in a similar sort of boat. Like, there's so much that people can come back from, and medicine is still improving as well. And so what we can come back from now may be different to what we can come back from later. So that sort of border will be changed and moved a little bit. Whereas once, someone's finally dust, I don't know if there's going to be any science getting us back from that in a hurry. So I consider that, once you're actually been put under the ground or cremated as ever it will be, or however people choose, I consider that to definitely be a very bold distinction of when one's alive and when one's not. But when we were talking about the other three deaths, the other two deaths before, in that vegetative state where you're not actually coming back from, you're not actually really creating any more connections with other people and things like that, and people will start losing theirs with you, and so you are actually starting to experience that second death in that vegetative state already. You know what I mean? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I never really thought of the line being blurred, at least for that being remembered thing. But I think I agree with you that even in the vegetative state, you can already be on that process to, that second death of not being remembered, not being able to connect with other people and having them connect with you. One thing that I think that's really interesting that Jordan brought up is the idea of not being able to come back from something and that being a marker of when you die. And then Duncan also touched on it with, technology improving, but I think there's this very strange, epistemic aspect to that of just not knowing whether somebody is dead because you don't know whether or not they're going to come out of the coma, whether or not there's the adequate medical resources to get them out. And some people just by chance they don't wake up, or they do wake up from comas. And so if that's the way that we're going to go, it's really interesting, because in that case, we don't know whether or not a person's dead, and we might not know for a pretty extended amount of time. Some people stay in comas for years, but a lot of them. And that's really interesting in terms of implications. How do we treat somebody who we don't know is dead?
Yeah. I think that's, go ahead.
I was going to say, just going kind of back to Duncan's point, getting off of the physical a little bit. He talked about the three deaths, and I like that, but I think there also may be so that there seems to be some sense of conscious awareness that you're attributing to the death, because okay, we could say, let's say I embody a pattern of interaction in a it's not original, but in a pseudo original sense, and that it is acted out among a group of my peers for eons to come. This is what we'd call a hero, maybe a religious hero. But in a sense, without them knowing me, they have enacted a pattern of behavior that I may have been sort of the origin of. In a sense, my death might not even, I guess we have to define me in this sense too. We're just going to go through the whole litany of problems. Because in what sense has my original contribution, or not, I'm using original as a catch-all, but obviously not. But in what sense is my sort of influential contribution that lasts for ages, in what sense do I ever die if that contribution, people are still worshiping Jesus and it's 2,000 years later, and they'll probably be doing it for another, couple thousand. And it's he's been dead, and even when And even when the last Christian is just dies, the influences of Christianity will just continue to there's no point at which something just stops. It just builds. So it's you were just a part of the system in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
every person is a baby step in the progress of humanity. Is somewhat. Yeah.
I could have just said that.
So my concern with the permanency conjecture is we really don't, if we believe in the laws of thermodynamics, we really aren't in position to say that the atoms couldn't rearrange, unfortunately, although highly, highly, highly improbable, because the system tends towards a thermodynamic equilibrium. We can't say for sure that things could just rearrange, and then but this motivates in me a further concern, which is this: if we partition the interval of space-time such that we find, say, the gaps in a person's consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Or if we consider changing reference frames, it becomes apparent that our innocuous and perhaps naive conception of what a person and what you are may not be as simple as a singular ontology we imagine. It may be that these things that are living, whatever that means, live on a subset of defined intervals of space-time. And so I guess what I'm saying is the concern not only between instantiations of living, meaning if there was living here and somehow we define death as a gap between those instances of living, e.g. somehow between these instances, things rearranged, and depending on our definition of the same entity, it was or was not the same, right? That's debatable, whether that's the same person or living thing. If everything rearranged and made you back, I don't know. But depending on whatever definition, if we have that as concern, that things could do that, then if we zoom in on this individual instance of living, we'll find perhaps in the definition itself gaps in that defined process, just in lieu of how the physics operates. And so my concern then is that this, if substantive, this would be defined counterintuitively on certain scales, and thus with a bevy of inobvious physical implications as constraints.
Yeah. Yeah.
So are you saying that it is like we don't even have a good definition of what it means to be alive as one consistent person?
I mean, tabling the discussion of personhood just because I think
Yeah.
we were both, but just a living thing, whatever that would mean, because I don't think all living things are necessarily persons. I don't know, but whatever living would mean, I'm just pointing out that it may counterintuitively, if it has like if it is in some way, even from a dualistic perspective, biconditionally related to a physical phenomenon as we understand in this physical system that we believe to be our universe, we may have an issue of the tendency of those physical systems to occur over intervals of time, to therefore have a periodicity that defines the phenomenon. And thus, I guess what I'm asking is this: is it a process living, or is it a verb or a noun, or is it a biconditional relation between both? Because if it's a noun, it may be independent of this problem, but maybe not, because some nouns are not independent of this problem, meaning like, I guess what I'm saying is like, consider this cup. Is the cup, like, if I zoom in at a molecular level, do I have the cup? Or do I have to go to a certain scale for a certain system to define the cup? And if I do, my concern is, it's not that it couldn't be done, right? It's just that I worry that the use of language of calling this a cup, just like calling something a living thing, may create the illusion of a specificity that doesn't exist.
That's where we get into functional categories. So like that, because that could also be a bowl. You know, it's like a cup. It could be a bowl.
Yeah.
I mean,
matter of perspective, whether you got noodles in it.
Well, it seems to me like, Chris, what you're saying about the like, if my atoms just rearranged after I died, like 100 years later, and I was just back on the earth, it's like there seems to be a sense of like self that acts in this functional way of like cup, to where there's a continual perception of the essence of an interaction between my relation of that continual perception on the outside world. So that's what you're doing with the cup. I could say it's a bowl, but
you see, the concern is that if we have an implication from that being it is or it isn't you, if you could reconfigure, I worry what that would imply if we then applied a similar analysis to zooming in on the gaps between the phenomenology that may be required on the scale you exist. Right. And then the problem may not disappear only in examination of depth. And I'm sorry if I've made this overly complicated.
No, that's good. That's great. That's great. Like the gaps are the important part, because it's like if I cease to be, if everybody stopped remembering what cup was, like, would there even be a cup? Or if the cup did stop existing, you know, if nobody made it anymore, is there still such thing as a cup? And that's where I'm saying a lot of these things are in a more at the perceptual level, like our ideas of what it means to be at all a thing are sort of, they aren't infinite, and we're never going to get into an infinite definition. And so we shouldn't even attempt to do that, because we'd render it useless for functionality.
Yeah, but you see how I claim that these points are not mere like novelties. These would have serious implications insofar as our analysis is concerned.
Okay,
like, meaning that at some level, it may not be tenable or even sensible in a physical sense to define a cup on a Planck scale. What exactly can you hold on a Planck scale?
Yeah,
you see, so it's like, I'm trying to say that it's not, perhaps it's inobvious the way I've articulated it, but it could have some serious implications and could expose what are hidden assumptions.
Well, I get what you're saying. You're talking about resolution, and I'm talking about.
I don't know what I'm talking about, to be honest.
It seems like we're talking about the resolution of what it means to be. I guess we're getting back into like that. We keep running back into this like personhood thing, and like this is weird.
And we're trying to avoid it.
Yeah, this topic is going to come around and bite us on the ass at some point.
Oh, God. It's just like 50 episodes of personhood.
So I think we've like poked death with a stick. Do you guys have any other things you want to say in relation to like death before session?
Hold on, is this live? Like I know it's live, but were people invited? Because I haven't seen any comments coming out. Is it just
I think they're watching at this point.
Okay.
We've got at least 3 people, but my feed is a subset of the set of all people watching. So usually it's around 6. They're watching.
Hey, people, feel free to comment, and if it's good, we'll talk about it. If it's stupid, we'll say good try.
So any thoughts, or should we proceed?
Proceed, and we might end up coming back as we sometimes do and tying it in.
Yeah, I would not be surprised.
Okay, so the next, the question we're really trying to examine is how should we die? And I guess before we discuss the ethical implications, why don't we ask ourselves that question insofar as it might pertain to how we would like to die. So I understand this is a problem considering we've already encountered an issue of trying to define death, right? So now we have to not only
maybe we can just work with an intuitive sense of death, a very like, common way of
death.
Let's go with the baseline. Yeah,
he's dead, Jim. But yeah, it's but
let's just start at physical death. Let's just start there.
Physical death.
Yeah.
Okay, so
good place to start.
Yeah, and let's just ask, how would we like, or is there a basis to the possible span of all instances? That, because there may be variations contingent on preference, but let us ask, for all those variations, is there a common denominator among them we might be able to identify that people would perhaps reliably prefer their death to be like?
Most people say peaceful, but then sometimes there's that sacrificial, so it's sort of hard to say. Most people prefer peaceful, but if it's meaningful enough, they will endure painful.
For me, like, whilst peaceful is cool and everything, and I do like the idea of that, I had experience with death when I was younger, and it got me thinking about it. And the sudden death is not preferable to me. I think I'd rather actually have some sort of illness or something like that, and which allowed me to then fully get my affairs in order and everything to then take care of business before I passed. That's just me.
Yeah, no, and I think that makes sense. I feel like a lot of people, if you were to ask them how they would want to die, they would, have it be in some sort of context where everybody that they love is still taken care of. Nobody's, caught off guard. Like their death causes, the minimal amount of harm on people that they care about. But I also think that how somebody would want to die would also probably depend on their views of death. So like Jordan said, some people might want to do like a big like sacrificial thing. I'm talking about this so casually, like you just want to die. But, like some people want to have a sacrificial death, or some people who are obsessed with the idea of like being remembered or being immortal might want to have a death where they're just remembered, and so it might be sort of like chaotic, so I think it really depends. There are going to be some commonalities, but I think a lot of it depends on what your views of just life are.
So we have an interesting question from Wes, and I think it's kind of like pertaining to the category that we're currently tackling, which is essentially like, since we're asking how would we like to die, and we're not yet tackling that in an ethical context, I guess the question is like, what experiences would you like to have in dying, is I think what he means, and how would pain relate to that? And the Philosophy Queen is asking, I think, this anticipation of death that causes the most suffering.
These are great questions, and I think we should center on the point of pain, because there's physical pain, and there's like the emotional longevity pain that Duncan's addressing, where you have a family to take care of and all these things. This is a random question, but super applicable. Have any of you ever fainted before?
Yes.
Okay.
Fainted
Yes,
or
I've come
passed out?
close. I've not physically fainted, but
Okay.
if and when I get my blood drawn, I get faint. Even
This
when
is
I
for
show
those-
up to like support someone, what
is
you
for those
was
who
getting
have-
your blood.
Yeah. This is for those who have actually fainted. So, Brielle, tell me about your experience with fainting, because I'll tell you mine, but you tell me yours first. Like, and related to the idea of this death thing.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if I can relate it to death, but my experience of fainting specifically, I was dehydrated and hungry, and I was doing a very, very intense workout. And I remember I was doing like dips on a machine, and I was on the floor, and I I don't remember much except for that my vision started to go black, and then when I woke up, I was just a little bit like hazy, but I don't remember much of it, to be honest.
How did you feel afterward? Did you feel euphoric? Did you feel scared? Did you feel what?
I honestly just felt confused and a little bit lightheaded. But it wasn't like I didn't feel happy. I just want to go drink some water and take a rest.
Okay, I guess we had a little different experience, because when I fainted, I was like, I'm not afraid to die anymore, because it was the first time that I had been 100% out of control, and like there was no point at which I recognized my out of controlness. It was almost euphoric in that my sense of self went away without my permission, but it almost didn't. It didn't even affect me. It was like, hi. It was like coming back. It's like I almost wouldn't have cared if I didn't come back, because I wouldn't have known. And so there's this sense of there's a sense of death that happens where there's that state of permission of letting go that, like, in a sense, you don't have control of, and I don't know. It was like a transcendent experience for me in a way. I was like,
So Jordan, you like to be choked out then? Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, actually, speaking of choked out, how I lost consciousness was thanks to my brother Alex. If Alex ever watches this, thank you for that. I was sparring his friend at the time, and he came up and put a chokehold on me, and I taught him all my counters, and he put me under. So when I got up, I was, a bit dazed, confused. I didn't fully understand what happened, and I was a little bit pissed off at my brother for attacking me at a particular time when I was indisposed. But it was a pleasant experience insofar as you could say.
Here's my question, Jordan. If you had that experience, and to Brielle and Duncan, if you had that experience, but during torture, okay, suppose that you are losing consciousness in a similar sense, and suppose that you have this strange notion of not being in a position of control, and perhaps being forced to relinquish control in some way, but you're being tortured. Say you're on the rack, and you're just being stretched and stretched and stretched, and you can feel your ligaments almost ready to be torn. Do you think you would feel the same? Hello, Cody. Welcome aboard.
No, I wouldn't, because the fainting is. So you're talking about death? Like, okay, do I die from your scenario, or do I?
No, you're just going to pass out. Do you think? I guess what I'm getting at is like, I don't know if it's enough for us to reference like only the phenomenon of a loss of lucidity. I guess what I'm asking is, what if there were other things that would accompany that?
This is great. Before we start, though, we want to go down this road. I brought this up. I'm not sure this is the most productive road. If it is, fine. But I feel like we're tangenting off into a place that may come back.
Bring us back.
Insofar as it relates to death, my question would be like, here's what I'm trying to motivate. It may not be enough to look only at the phenomenon of death per se, but what things could accompany that process of dying? For example, what if you're dying a painful death? Being tortured to death. In other words, I guess a good starting point is, who's going to sign up for being tortured to death? And by definition, I don't mean like just physical pain, because perhaps some people find pleasure from that. I'm talking about whatever. If there exists a non-empty set of ways that a person would be perturbed, let them be killed by that set of ways.
Well, I'm not even. Let's clarify this even more. I'm not even talking about the preceding events that happen before the death or fainting, which are two separate instances. I'm talking about after the fact.
Yeah, I'm more concerned about
the
up
proceeding.
to, because I don't know if it makes sense to talk about
Yeah.
when I'm dead. I don't know if that makes sense.
I
Well,
would bring it.
Bria
I would-
did-
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
I was gonna say Bria did it during exercise, which is close to torture, and I did mine in the middle of combat, which was not ideal. So I know that did taint my experience of it a little bit. I did wake up a little bit kind of in fight mode than I should have, maybe than most people who pass out, because I was trying to figure out what the hell happened. So I think the circumstances that happen prior to it do actually affect how you come back from such a thing.
My question
Like,
is simple. How many of you are signing up for torture?
No, but what I was getting at is, like, if you pass out in a panic, unsure of what's going on, everything's chaotic around you, when you wake up, you'll probably be in a panic still, or like you'll boot up in that condition, and you'll be like, what? Same way I was in the fight condition, and I woke up sort of somewhat in the fight condition. So I think very much it does affect how we then come back.
Would you want to feel, so this is an interesting point. Since there's a bevy of reasons that people could be afraid, let's just say, suppose a person is experiencing fear in the process of dying. Is that a mindset that you would want to be in?
No, absolutely.
Right. Would you
No.
want to be in the mindset of being afraid while being tortured in whatever way is applicable, if applicable to you?
I don't see why anybody would want to be in that mindset. I think that part of what is, I guess, nice or remarkable, neither of those are the right words, noteworthy, about what Jordan was saying was this idea of like finally being able to let go of the fear of death. And that being coupled with letting go of that sense of, I guess, control in a way that can actually be very peaceful. And going back to this torture example, it might be that you're in a state of pain, but again, it's that state. And I think in some cases, you're just not going to be able to get over that physical pain. But again, I think the mental thing of relinquishing that control is important. So I don't know how much, like how detailed I want to get on the whole torture thing, but there are lots of ways to torture somebody where torturers are actually really skilled at just keeping you right on the brink of life and then bringing you back from an unconscious state to torture you more. And that there have been, scientific studies done on how to most effectively torture people. And on the other hand, there are also studies done on how to manage the pain, manage pain in general, and also manage pain and being tortured. And a lot of it has to do with kind of mentally removing yourself from the situation and making peace with it, whatever that may be. For some people, that may be literal physical pain. And for other people, that may be just, like the fear of dying. And those are two different kinds of pain and anguish to go through. But I think a big part of how people would ideally like to die, I would think, is, getting rid of that anguish surrounding death.
Yeah, I think that's a
Can I expand on that a little bit? I think that also, like, people being individuals does change a lot of things too, because it's more about the mindset than about what's happening. Some people could be being tortured and be actually, in a way, kind of fine with it, whereas someone could be having a totally peaceful death and not fine with it at all, and actually be more in a more traumatic state than the person who's actually being tortured for some reason. You know what I mean? That's just because humans are like that.
Yeah. The reason I brought up these things, and Ricardo, the question is phrased insofar as it may pertain to ethics and experiences, at least those things, perhaps more. But the reason I brought up the torture, the state of fear, it isn't so much to say this is what will happen, or even to assume that it will happen, as much as to identify subsets of instances or states of existences that we may or may not think most people would want to be dying in, and then from those subsets extrapolate, okay, how could that not occur? But of course that could be futile if and when there's nothing you could do about it. So it may not be applicable to all instances of dying. But whatever instances, it's really trying to feel out rocks in the nebulous river surrounding this question. What stones could we possibly stand on?
Yeah, I think it's the pain question. Like somebody asked something about this earlier. Should we get to some more questions, guys? Many. I don't see many, but I haven't been reading them.
Well, here's one question, and I think it's an interesting one.
But maybe one of the central fears surrounding death is the understanding that in most likelihood, you won't be able to have the potential to experience the things that matter to you.
Yes.
Yep.
That's very true. But Chris, one time in Truth Through Reason, you and Yusra brought up this really good point that's like stuck with me forever. Where you were talking about people are afraid to die, but they weren't afraid of before
the time they were born. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So there seems to be this the potential of experience, because like it's the same thing as before you were born. Like, do you care? It's just like the fact that this whatever I'm doing ends and I can't comprehend that seems to be the fear.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you even think about it hypothetically, a lot of the sadness and the negative feelings that accompany death have to do with like losing out on things. So losing out on more interactions with your loved ones, losing out on maybe a life project that you didn't get to finish. But if we think about somebody who is old, has lived a full life, has gotten to do everything that they've wanted to do before dying, and they're happy, successful, their family and loved ones are taken care of, they've done everything, they've traveled the world, whatever. It seems like we would be a lot less sad. We would think about that death in a much better light than we would somebody who died early and had what we think to be the rest of their life taken from them. But if there's no conception of like the rest of their life, like they're at the end of their human life at least, then it seems like we would think that is a lot less sad, at least intuitively.
I don't know if fear, loss, and pain are necessarily the same, but I don't think the sets are have a non-empty intersection if they could be adequately well defined. But I do think what we're really, and it maybe the way that we've phrased things isn't sufficiently concretized. It's not even necessarily death as much as the process of dying that we seem to be discussing.
Well, I want to go to Cody's point. I think we could steelman that a bit more. I think there's a similar response that they all elicit that almost makes them feel, in a sense, the same. It's sort of this unknown and out of control element to where, like, I knew what I was doing, but then I experienced this, and I'm not sure how to get to here. So it's sort of like I'm trying to go from A to C, but I went to B and I went to B and I went to this, and it's sort of like it's more of this trajectory of that it's the issue, and that's also why dying poses such a problem, because it is the end of the set of trajectories as far as you know, and so it presents like the ultimate problem of that I can no longer, like I am in the state of being. What is it like to not be in the state of being? I have no idea,
Mm.
Do we
have no way of knowing, so yeah. People have a tendency to fear the unknown.
I'm seriously gonna die if I don't pee right now.
Philosophy Queen, sorry, I don't know anybody's real name. Philosophy Queen brought up a comment that I only saw briefly, but they mentioned religion, and that being one of the things that people use to help cope with death. I don't remember. Is there a way to bring up that comment?
Yeah, let me scroll up, which is this one, which is why religions center around appealing to immorality.
Yeah, so here's an interesting question. Does that make you guys more comfortable with the idea of death? Like, do you think that you would be more comfortable with the idea of death if you did believe in a religion? And I'm not saying that, anybody here is religious or not religious, but do you think that would be preferable? Because we don't really have control over what we believe or not. I think it's just a matter of like whether or not we do believe it. But if one did believe in religion, do you think that would make them more comfortable with the idea of dying?
So I've got a.
Yeah, I think that's one of the purposes of religion. Someone else? Yeah.
I was going to say that the death anxiety hypothesis of religion is a good one, but I think it's an incomplete one because fundamentally it's more of a byproduct of religion than it is the feature. I think the feature of religion is these axioms symbolized in ways that you understand how to live, and part of the expression of being extends into the afterlife. So there is a sense of peace that comes through knowing, hey, I have a place to go. But in a sense also, because, okay, while not, I don't believe any of us here subscribe to a certain like popular religion, we have a set of implicit axioms that either make us uncomfortable or comfortable with death in the same functional way that a religion would. And we would not say that our rational preferences, in a sense, we wouldn't say they're strictly limited to making us feel better about death as they are informing us how to live, which is death is a part of living at the end.
I don't know that I would agree with that classification of religion. I think that I for sure, lots of religions teach us how to live, but even just like historically, I think lots of religions have been created to help us explain phenomena that we don't yet understand. So like lots of I don't know, lots of religions have stories about how thunder, before we understood the actual physical process of it, was like gods fighting in the sky, and that the solar or lunar eclipse was like some super interesting, whatever, like
crazy story. Yep.
Yeah, like some godly phenomena. And I think that one of the reasons, as Philosophy Queen brought up, that religions are so centered on this idea of like life after death or immortality is just because that's just one of the things that religion is meant to explain that we don't understand.
Yes, and maybe I didn't make my point clear enough.
Whoa,
That was my water bottle. Sorry.
Nice.
We're good.
What I'm saying is that is.
You meant to drop the bike afterwards.
Yeah, I'm not saying that that's not a feature. I'm just not saying that's the only feature. Like,
yeah, I think it's multifaceted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is all of those things. And when I think about religions, I think about, okay, this is sort of complicated. I'm not even sure if we should get into this, but I'll briefly give you a synopsis. What happens with belief systems is that they are body up into cognitive, not cognitive down into body. So what happens is we interact with an environment. We have something programmed into our nervous system that tells us how to behave, and then that pattern of behavior across domains becomes more specified. And then what emerges is the best of us who can do that pattern of behavior to interact with the environment. And then that hero of those sets becomes a figure of the representation of that interaction with environment. So then we have a religious sense of how we interact with this compromised average of the environment. So it's sort of like you guys have probably heard this, like a metaphorically true, but like actually false. And that's what religions are.
I don't know. I don't think you're doing yourself any favors. You're just digging a deeper ditch there, Jordan. But
how so?
Yeah, it's just because. Well, I'll tell you, because the more technical we get, the worse it's going to be. I can promise you. It's what I don't really know what I would say insofar as the religion is concerned. because it seems it would depend on what a person believes. And
Sure.
it's not clear to me if we're arguing belief and the extent to which one opposes belief with knowledge, however one makes such a distinction. If one defines faith, for example, as a type of belief where there is less and less confidence as to the outcome, then the more faith we have, the more we could replace whatever we assert we have faith in with anything else, right? So the more faith I have in something, it seems the harder it is for me to pinpoint what I have faith in. And cognitively, that poses a potential issue if and when we're talking about religion in a faith sense, because then we have the potential problem of like, I have faith in this thing, but the more faith I have, the less of an ability I really have to distinguish what I have faith in from anything else. And so then it's not clear how I can argue in any sense that the thing I have faith in is what gives me the resolve I have, right? It'd be like,
It's the faith that you have in it rather than the actual thing itself.
I don't know,
It's like a placebo effect, somewhat. I feel.
right,
would
but
Sorry.
I don't know. It's more of a question. It's not a premise. It's a point of exploration that I would.
What I'm thinking is, I mean, if medication, if you take like I said with placebo, right? If you have a headache and you take a pill and that pill actually solves the headache, and we can trace it back to the pill's ingredients, then that pill is effective. But if everyone is taking a different type of pill and they're all getting the similar result, maybe it's the action of taking the pill as opposed to the pill itself. Switch pill with the religion.
I understand what you're saying. I'm telling you, I don't know. Just because it.
I'm not
surface-
claiming to actually know for sure. I'm just throwing stuff out there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Or checking my vocabulary. I'm Australian.
Chris, your objection is really good. I think it's the crux of
It's not an objection. It's a question.
Okay, well, this is the crux of what we're talking about then, because I think what we are doing right now is enacting a religious structure where we have accepted implicit axioms that we've had to take faith on to say what I am is an agent of the world, what everybody in this chat is doing too. We're agents of the world that can and should try to find the most direct way to interact with the world and extract an outcome from it. But that's not an obvious conclusion. Like all of scientific rationality, all of what we have is a religious assumption. I know this is weird, but like we have assumed that what we can do is use ones and zeros to make a computer, and it worked. We can look at the world and
I understand what you're saying, but our inability to fundamentally prove everything isn't quite the same as having a religious perspective per se. I don't know if that's the same thing.
Exact same. One's just deeper than the other.
I see where you're coming from there. It's just saying like there are things in our conversations that we come across that we can't know for sure one way or the other, but we have to sort of use that as a jumping off point to which to then delve into other things. And that has one or two correlations between religion and our conversation. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and I'm saying like why do we even act as if we have potential? That's a religious assumption. It's not obvious at all.
Well, all right. I think that the problem with the analogy, because I think what you're trying to say is that fundamentally, if we're unable to prove anything, including, for example, axioms of logic, it seems that we're accepting to some degree things on faith.
Yes.
However, you can't infer from that a consequent, Jordan, because then you're relying on a logical structure to make that inference, the structure of logical implication. You don't get to take something away from that, is what I'm trying to tell you, necessarily.
Okay,
you're relying on what's called a conditional, as defined in classical binary truth value systems of logic, and we assume that the conditional works, but we don't know. And so it's what I'm trying to tell you is when you go down to that level, it's really hard to infer anything, because then we're relying on fundamental structures of logic that are almost hidden behind the analysis.
Well, I think if I hear you correctly, that's what I'm saying. Pretty much we're relegated to is we have.
I don't know.
I think we have to enact with the world like that.
I don't know, because if I succeed in my dissertation, which I don't know if it's possible, that may not be true. For all we know, we may be able to axiomatize logic. Our inability to do so right now doesn't mean it's impossible in principle.
No, I agree with you, and that's why I'm so looking forward to what you attempt to do.
Well, maybe impossible. I don't know.
It may be impossible, but what I'm also saying is that even if you succeed, the until it can be broadly disseminated in a way that people can understand, and even when they do understand it, it will be in a sense religious, because if you find something that makes the most sense, it will have to be palatable for people to grasp, and they won't one-to-one understand what you write. They will have to have it functionally symbolized down into words.
The way the same way that like we take what scientists say with a degree, with a touch of faith, sort of things. Like I don't know. Well, not so much with Christopher. He actually understands science. I don't understand all the science in the world. And so when someone says something does this, and there's a whole bunch of scientists that actually agree on it and sign off on it and stuff like that, I actually go, well, you know what? If I don't understand it and these guys have spent their lives studying it, then maybe they've got a point, and I would take their word for it. That's a degree of faith, I guess.
In a sense, I think that's one where it's a little more like you can get around it, because that's just an appeal to authority that you shouldn't do. I'm talking about.
It's impossible to know all things, though.
Well, you're right. You're right in that's like the most shallow version of what I'm talking about, where like rationalists will say like, hey, listen, like we should not use appeals to authority, majority, all these things. What I'm saying at some point you get to a place where you appeal to something on a Kierkegaardian faith-based level, even if it's just the assumption that I have potential and I should interact with the world. Because there's nothing obvious about what we're doing right now. Like, why are we having this conversation? Why do we even think that this is fruitful?
I hear what you're saying. I feel like we're getting off topic.
Sure.
Actually, can I drag it back for a sec?
Yeah. Sorry.
Because it actually relates to the whole thing, right? But I would also just add one of the differences between us, our conversation that we're having at the moment, and religion is that we say, I don't know a lot more. But when it comes to religion, it actually brings us back to an interesting thing that Chris actually got me to look into before, when talking about death and self-sacrifice. And it was saying, is sacrifice possible if you know that there is a reward after us? And it was an interesting question that came up in the article that they got me to read. Does that mean that people who believe in an afterlife and they're going to get rewarded are actually incapable of doing the ultimate self-sacrifice as purely as others would, or even at all if they're getting rewarded? Yeah,
I think that's a good turning point for us to start talking about the ethical implications of dying. We can table the remarks that Jordan has made as Jordan. I'd like to have that conversation with you, but I think we're going to have to go a lot deeper into the epistemology and the mathematical philosophy. And I think you'd be surprised at how many hidden assumptions there are that are
I'd love to be in on that conversation.
We can have the discussion, but we're going to need probably a screen share and a different time to do that. And I'll bring in some professors of mathematical philosophy as well as some people in epistemology. I think you'd be surprised. You can't refer to faith necessarily, even. It's complicated. Okay, I don't know, but
very fair.
But moving from that, I'd like to discuss the question of how we should die insofar as it relates to an ethical context. So, it would be contingent, I think, on which ethical theory we were referring to. So, perhaps first we'll consider maybe what a consequentialist might say. And so, here's a question for you guys: what would a consequentialist say to the ability to have an ethical dimension insofar as like the consequences of your death, if and when we assume an empty set of applicable moral agents after your death? So suppose, in other words, that I've got a button. I can press this button and it will induce some kind of physical reaction that will occur in a time t less than the time that any entity in the system could perceivably have a thought and kill each of us. Would that be applicable to the set of ethical ways to die? And that would be motivating a further question, which is, would there be constraints from a consequentialist perspective as to when the question, how should we die, is ethically applicable at all.
That's interesting, because if you're going under the idea of like doing no harm or something like that, and you go with the idea that once we can't feel anything, then there's no harm happening to us, then they could actually argue that everyone getting wiped out at once is ethical, and you could also argue probably for the betterment of the universe.
Yeah, I actually have a friend who believes this. I remember it was like a 4-hour drive, and the conversation lasted the whole car ride. But it was basically the same hypothetical, if you could push a button that could instantly end the life of everybody on Earth, would you do it? And she, being a consequentialist, she genuinely believed that was the right thing to do. And to me, it just seemed so wrong at the time, but her justification for it was that, look, consequentialism is not just about maximizing the good, but it's also about minimizing the bad. And there is so much suffering in the world going on by humans. If you think about, poverty and hunger and exploitation,
environmental damage.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just the pain that humans are suffering, but the pain that humans are causing to other humans and to other sentient beings.
Exactly right, to everything.
She thought, look, this is really the way to go in terms of like what the best thing to do would be. It would be to push that button. But I think lots of people would think that was wrong.
Well, no offense to like your friend, but I don't think this is an incredibly like deep or interesting philosophy, because it's been around forever. So it's just basically it's a totalitarian type of system. So it's a supervillain that's like a Thanos. You guys have seen the Avengers, right?
Yeah.
I have not.
What? You haven't seen the MCU? Are you kidding?
I haven't seen any like Marvel movie ever.
Oh my god.
It's fine.
Fair enough. Just deleting a few references out of my head for the moment. It's okay.
Take a lot
Done.
of movies. This is what I feel like. How do I frame this most productively? This is not a thought of originality as much as it is an ever-present, it's almost crazy how much of like a personality this is as a part of the human feature, because there's always in a story a type of villain who has a super rational ideology that would encompass all things, but then at the same time destroy all things. Because what we are as humans are not total creatures across a time frame. And it's arbitrary to take a time frame and say, well, everything would just be better off if nobody existed, because in what sense is everything better off? Because the experience of everything is the experience of somebody experiencing the set of the things that will now not exist. And so there needs to be an iterable instantiation of that thing to continue so that it can be perceived as good. You can't just take a random time frame and say, well, over 5,000 years, we could take this and wipe it out. Over 10,000 years, we could take this thing and wipe it out. Maybe if all humans didn't exist, we'd eliminate suffering. But it's like, that's an arbitrary way to draw a line,
But would we as well? Because animals does everyone here believe that animals feel?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So so then animals can suffer, right? So animals could cause animals to suffer, maybe.
Well, we are animals, so I feel like
exactly right. I think we're on a point that's already been made.
Non-human animals, right?
It wouldn't actually get rid of all suffering, because zebras will still be getting eaten by lions and stuff like that. Pretty sure they don't enjoy that experience. But the main people, or the main being on the planet that does cause extensive damage and suffering, is us. So it would solve a lot of the problems. It wouldn't solve all the problems. And I think that those animals would be able to experience the less suffering, and therefore it would be good for a sentient being, even though that sentient being would not be human. If that,
sure. I think what I want us to try to do is to slow down and just focus on a subset of things that are sufficiently small that we can discuss this. because I feel like what's happening is we open a nexus into a set of such cardinality that I don't know if it's practical or that people
no, you should absolutely be that person that reins the conversation back in. What happens to these sorts of subjects is tangent.
So here's my question. Back to the original question. What I was trying to motivate was just a question of if there are constraints pertaining to a theory of consequentialism just built into the at the very least the physics or the mathematics, if applicable, of how that would work out, meaning at the very least it seems you've applied an order to the system. My question is, would there be a potential problem in not all deaths even applicably being classifiable as having a good death in terms of an ethical death as an option? Would that be unfortunate?
Sorry, say it one more time, Chris. I was writing something down.
In other words, the incompleteness of a theory across a domain of instances isn't, of course, necessarily a criticism, but does anyone see room for improvement?
Okay, you're going to need to say the question another way.
I'm wording it in a way maybe that's not so ideal. What I'm asking is how do we factor in this notion of a heroic death, if at all applicable? Because it seems that in some instances one could conceive of a heroic death from which we would not necessarily define that heroism if related to ethics in terms of the consequences and only the consequences.
Yeah, so we all read that paper, right?
We all what?
We all read that paper Chris sent, right?
I didn't send it to Chris.
Yeah, I think I sent it to different people. Yeah.
Wait, you sent it to Chris. The thing you sent me, you didn't send to everybody.
I sent it to you and only you.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I got a different one.
But that's the question. The question is essentially, do we think that consequentialism encapsulates the broader spectrum of ethical situations that may be applicable to instances of dying, such as heroic deaths, which not all of which are necessarily functions of what will happen after. Some of them could be observed as a person persisting through the process of dying in the face of what could be just a horrible outlook or a horrible prospect, but doing so in what we would call a heroic way. Is that separate from or related to the set of ethical phenomenon?
That's a good question. Can one have a heroic death without having an impact, without consequence?
Yeah. Can you essentially have a Sisyphean heroic death? If not
Sisyphean
in terms of the potential for meaning, of course, but Sisyphean perhaps in the impact across a time interval t, such that the interval of time is defined over some subset of time over which you, for whatever reason, don't exist.
Nope, I didn't understand that. But just in terms of like this heroic death without any consequences, I don't know that is possible just because of the way that we use the word heroic. Like, in order for something to be considered heroic, something positive in a broad sense has to come from it. Otherwise, it's not going to be heroic. But I think the way that we could think of something as being heroic could absolutely, be something very broad. So just going back to, I forgot who brought up the example, but somebody who's like suffering through a painful death for no concrete consequence, but maybe they're seen as a hero, maybe for like religious reasons, let's say, and they think that it's wrong to like kill yourself. So they suffer through it. And that could be heroic in the sense that there's nothing concrete gained by it, but there is still a good that comes from it, and a consequentialist good, I would say, because it might inspire other people. It might reaffirm other people's faith. It might give them a feeling of like, just something there. And even though that's not concrete, I think that's still a consequence that is.
I agree. I agree, because that's facing a trial and overcoming it and sort of things, and that's very much a heroic act, I feel. So I think you're onto something there.
So here's my question:
I'm
if we
scribbling down
imagine,
notes like crazy here to try and create
imagine a
my
universe where everything is about to end in this universe, right?
Yeah.
Is there a heroic way we could approach that, or is there just is that concept not applicable there? Meaning, if we try to argue for all intents and purposes that there's not going to be a consequentialist analysis, then is heroism even an applicable concept there? In other words, are we just...
So there's two different people on the planet that are all, like, the whole universe is dying at once. Could one person be having a heroic death compared to someone else, or is everyone else having a heroic death and therefore making the term meaningless? Can someone else take over thinking for a second?
Let me read this in. Isn't the act of heroism just mitigating the amount of suffering? In that,
I don't know, because that's a classical way to define it, but unfortunately, it's not that simple. You know, some people may imagine heroism quite differently from what we, innocuously assume it to be.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that even though all things are relative, does my contribution necessarily need to be eternal? Because nothing is going to be eternal.
Right. Well, that's not the question. I'm not requiring of anything that it be eternal. I want to make that clear. I'm saying insofar as mapping a relation between ourselves and a future thing.
Yeah.
If we assume that we allow for no such relation to be analyzed, that is to say, if we assume no such relation will exist.
Well, where does the relation not exist? Because if a meteor is about to hit Earth in a minute, I have a minute to engage.
Right, but after that, all right, so that's not quite what I'm describing, because it's like still in the universe and we're still defining something across time.
Then how is it not eternal if it's not that?
It's more so a counterfactual hypothetical. We're not worried about whether it could occur per se. We're trying to feel out the territory in the exploration of the hypothetical.
Flesh that out more, because I'm confused between the 60 seconds and the eternal thing. There's this point that you're at that I'm not.
So some physicists define differing universes as those that have no causal relation. So, for example, if you have an expansion of space in excess of the speed of light, some theoretical physicists argue that those things are now classifiably their own universes.
Yeah, sure.
And so there's an ontological debate as to what constitutes a definition for a universe, therefore.
Yeah.
And, it's not clear whether there are some types of relations that could occur, therefore, between universes. And so, however we define it, what I'm saying is whatever sets of relations that we're mapping between a permutation of states. In this hypothetical, we are presupposing an end to that permutation.
Well, there's always an end to. I mean, I guess why are we relegating it just to the instance where the world ends in 60 seconds? Because eventually, like, the world's going to end. So why not talk about it now in terms of then? I mean,
what I'm trying to point out is I don't know if in those situations we can necessarily justify after it occurs.
Well, we can never justify after.
I don't know.
Might be that.
Well, I don't think that's the point, though. I don't think it's the point to justify it after the fact, because just the fact that our actions don't exist across eternal time frames. I know you're not. I guess I don't see why we're not talking about eternity.
All right, so the reason I'm concerned with after is, let's say I die to allow other people to live.
Yeah.
Then I'm doing this for a purpose after my death, defined on a set of applicable moral agents.
Sure.
That's what I'm saying. If we remove that set as a possible mapping.
Yeah. No, I get that.
No, then no. You can possibly die a heroic death if there's nobody to value it, right? Because heroism is a type of thing that has value. Like that's what it is, like, necessarily. And value, I don't think, is something that exists independent of creatures that have the ability to value.
Yeah.
So if there's, if that set doesn't exist anymore, if we can't map that onto any human beings, any sentient beings, nothing to like process the action that we did, then there's not going to be any value in it, and there's therefore not going to be any heroism in it.
Okay,
Right?
This is the point where I'm confused, because there's not a value in the eternal sense. Like,
I guess that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if value is defined on, say, a set of sentient entities, then a way perhaps to remove that set from being applicable is just that they, to not allow for a thing to exist. But insofar as Cody's remark, we're not talking about the end as in of all things. I don't even know if that's applicable to all things that exist. Some things don't have a concept of beginning and end as applicable necessarily. So we're not talking about the set of all things, because there's no set of all sets that mathematically breaks down.
We're talking about the set of those that can experience.
Right. We're talking about a subset, just to be clear. It's not mathematically correct to talk about everything, because everything is not as simple as we think it to be. There's no set of all sets.
Yeah, important distinction. So let me ask you this. If I make a sacrifice that cannot be experienced by anybody, although there are people around that could potentially experience it. Like, let's say I pay for somebody's food, but then they never get. Sorry, I'm gonna direct the line. Yeah, they never get the food, or they end up paying for the food. Did I make a sacrifice? And I would say you did. It just wasn't received. So I still made a sacrifice even without reception. It doesn't have to necessarily have the reception to make a sacrifice.
Yeah. A successful sacrifice is different than a sacrifice.
Successful sacrifice. So now
without being successful.
So, but now we're changing what we're talking about, and this is where I'm confused here. And that, does it have to be received in order to happen?
All right, let's make it simpler. Okay. 2 sets.
Okay.
And let me do something even simpler than that. I'm just going to pull up Paint and we'll screen share, just to make pretty clear what I'm trying to say. And screen share.
Also, this is like my favorite Guild of Inquiry so far. This is like a really fun one.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'm saying is, if we have 2 sets, A and B, not necessarily distinct, right?
Yeah.
We are defining some relation R. Could be biconditional, could be functional. We're not getting into that specificity. We're just saying, let us suppose that if this is a relation between these sets with a parameter of time, t, we're not saying whether time fundamentally exists. We're just saying if we have a parameterization between them, such that the relation could be associated with an increasing orientation of that parameter, we are saying that if these 2 sets are distinguished across that parameter t, choose a time t naught such that after that time, we do not have a relation between these sets. That is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm saying that the relation is defined if and only if we have a certain interval.
Yeah.
Okay. And not necessarily interval in the mathematical definition of like an uncountable compact subset of R. It's just it could be a countable set. All I'm saying is, I guess what I'm asking is, does heroism require a relation between things? And if it does, and not just heroism, but perhaps substantiveness, if that's, and if it does, what do we say? Do all instances of death have this as an applicable concept? Because if they don't, here's where I'm leading with it. You're probably wondering perhaps where I'm going with this. Well, if we consider what are called light cones in general relativity, we can get into instances where causation takes time, if our understanding of the universe is correct. And sometimes then it's not clear if the meaning we insist exists at a time exists until a certain time.
Yeah. I feel like this is where my drive-through example comes in really nicely, because my A is paying for the potential of them getting their food behind me. Where the set does not map onto B is that the cashier's an idiot and doesn't do it.
Yeah.
But like I still did it, you know, and this is
Yeah, you still paid for it, but the person didn't get their food, or
I was a hero, although it did not map onto the function. You see what I'm saying?
yeah, I see what you're saying. I wrote down your point because I thought it was
So
actually
here's
very
what I'm
good, and I
pointing
wanted to
out.
come back to
If
it.
that's the case, then what that reveals about our definition of heroism is it's not necessarily requiring a relation between distinct sets per se.
Yeah, I don't.
In that way.
I disagree. I think there's a disanalogy between the drive-through example and an example where there is just absolutely no set at all to map onto. Like, let's imagine a world in which, say, somehow you are the only person alive, and somehow you still have like money or whatever, but and it has value, and you go up to like this automated drive-through and you pay for the next person's meal, but there's just no person there, right? I think in order for heroism to mean something, there has to be the potential for it to map onto something. Like even in the drive-through example, there's the potential for it to succeed. Whereas in a case where there's just nothing at all to map onto from the very beginning, there's not even a potential for it to succeed.
I agree with you actually, but you're talking about the meaning of it versus I think what maybe Christopher is talking about in the mathematical sense, like.
Well, no. When I said what I said, I was pointing out an implication that may follow, but that doesn't mean I agreed with the implication. I was just explaining that it. But of course, there is a caveat here, Brielle, which I wonder about, which is like, can it have a reflexivity? Can heroism be defined in a reflexive manner where a thing can be heroic towards itself? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, again, though, if we have a chronology of time and we stop that, we still have a problem.
Well, okay, what do you guys think about this point? Think about everything we've said. The sets that are produced by my experience as a human of there even being a thing. So I'm going to screw this up. Hold on. Let me come back to this point. I'm going to fuck this up. I already know I'm going to fuck this up. Go back to what you're saying.
Okay. Hang on. I just I can sort of see where you're going. I'll let you get there and the words in your mouth. But there was a good question from Ricardo before that we sort of missed, and it was
okay.
Does something need a goal? Hang on, I want to actually get the exact bloody thing. I don't want to get it wrong.
I have the question pulled up?
Can a heroic death be still called a heroic death if the goal is not previously defined?
Mm.
I thought that was an interesting thing too, which pertains to the whole thing that we're trying to do.
Oh my God, I think that's a great question.
That's what I've been trying to get back to it the whole time. It was a while back. Sorry, Ricardo, but we got there.
If you were accidentally a hero, are you even a hero?
Exactly right.
Like if I kick a ball and the ball like hits a car, but the car like misses a lady, like I would have been a douche for like hitting the car with the ball, but then I'm a hero because he didn't kill a lady.
Unless we require of heroism like some kind of relational mapping between intent and action, right?
Yes.
This is actually good because it links it back to the whole thing we were saying before. Because we were talking about set A with an empty set of B, and now we're talking about set B with an empty set of A. Like
if you're talking about intent, right. If you're talking about intent,
yeah, there was no intent, but the one had intent with no consequence, and this one had consequence with no intent. That's what I was getting at.
It's possible, yeah, but
I think both of those things are possible as long as it's possible for there to be a mapping, even if it wasn't intended to be a mapping. So long as the possibility exists somewhere out there, then I think that's fine. Like we have like martyrs, we like celebrate people who died accidentally and then turn them into heroes, and that's so that is just fine.
That plays. Cool.
So
Thank you.
My question there. If
for example,
I'm sorry.
I was just congratulating Brielle on her example with the martyr. That sort of solves a question I had myself.
Gotcha. Yeah. So if we take that position, which I find interesting. My question then is like, let's consider, I mean, this is going to be weird, but back to the question of like reflexivity. Can you like be heroic towards yourself? And if you can there be a distinction between you not being heroic to others and then which are you? So suppose that you do. So I guess what I'm concerned about is like, it seems to me that heroism may implicitly be related to like what you're considering in the set of things related to each other. Because like or it's just two distinct entities. If I do something heroic, like buy someone lunch, I don't think that's heroic personally necessarily. But then I do, in doing that, I have some imposition of an opportunity cost that I wasn't aware of, or maybe I was aware of that was unfavorable to another person. Am I then a hero? In other words, does the definition further require that we have no ambiguity of this sort?
Yeah, this is great. Okay, what do you guys? Branching off of this, like a little bit off, but a little bit on, there seems to be, I think we need to focus in on intent, because it seems to me like heroism, and this is not by any means a complete definition. I'm throwing this out here, you pick it apart. Heroism seems to be the intent to produce a good outcome, and that can happen across domains of individuality, familial, societally. Go with that.
So I was scribbling down notes.
Yeah.
How come?
You're like we look at the notes and it's just like this diagram of like a ball hitting a car and like a lady.
it kind of looks a little bit like this.
Nice.
I got really bad handwriting.
I really like that, dude. That's a great way of thinking, like, is drawing these lines in relations. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Nice, man. I like that. I'm gonna use that.
Yeah. That's like how flow charts come very naturally to me. I saw a flow chart. I was like, someone's made how I think. Excellent.
All right. So the reason I'm bringing up the possible conflict of opportunity cost is to kind of mesh that with our previous discussion pertaining to heroism, pertaining to consequentialism. Is I worry about instances. So in other words, it would appear to me that the set of applicable ethical and heroic deaths may shrink and not be applicable to all instances, because we may have instances where there are opportunity costs that make it unclear how we define the ethics of a death and the heroism of a death.
So, Chris, if I'm understanding you correctly, you were saying, like, let's say I do something nice for somebody else, but then I realize I could have done more good with it somewhere else.
Oh, no. I mean, that's one, but I'm saying, what if counterintuitively in doing something nice for someone, or more than nice, heroic for someone, you've done something that in doing that may be in the negation of that classification for another.
Oh, I see what you mean. I see.
Like, say, someone actually used this example before. They said, what happens if you save baby Hitler? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Good for baby Hitler, bad for a whole bunch of other people.
Yes.
I mean, I think it depends on how reasonable, and then again, this just pushes the problem back, because now we have to define reasonable. But I think it depends on how reasonable it is to expect something bad to happen, right? So maybe let's say that your village is about to be flooded by this river. And so what you do is you build a dam to stop it from flooding. But that dam just disrupts this giant ecosystem. And that was all because of you. So you saved your river, or you saved your village, but you disrupt the ecosystem.
Yeah.
It seems like that, if you had just, talked to somebody, would have been completely avoidable, completely something that you could have expected. And that versus, saving baby Hitler. Like, you can't really predict what type of person somebody's going to grow up to be. That's not something that's reasonable to expect of somebody. So
Exactly right.
it depends on how whether or not it's reasonable to expect somebody to know the consequences of those actions further down the line.
Okay. So we have four components now. We have intent, consequence, awareness, and time. for heroism?
Well,
Hang
I-
on, intent, awareness, consequence, and time.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
I'd say implicit in those assumptions is that you have an ordering of systems, states of the system, but across which you could parameterize a variable that you could call time. So, but
Well, sure.
what?
But if we're
what
using
of-
words that way, we wouldn't use any words. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. It would turn into something, right? I mean, but
That's troublesome. Yeah.
what I'd like to
I like
kind
words.
of motivate from this now is a further question, which is in potential juxtaposition. Is there a time at which we should die such that others can live better? Not necessarily in the heroic sense, but in a sense that
Say that
may
if
not
everyone
even be
lived,
categorically heroic, in a sense that
So-
would be unfortunate for us.
well, like say if everyone lived to say 500 years or something, like as is natural, but that would actually crush the entire planet with the current way that we have our generate. So dying before our time in that regard, or something like that. You mean?
Well,
I
something
mean,
like that?
no particular situation comes
I
readily
use
to mind.
situations to get. Yeah, I just try and get something so I can meld it
And
into my
I'm
head.
trying not to go to a specific instance because I don't want that to lead me to like implicit assumptions. But
Mhm.
The idea is that maybe there's a non-empty subset of instances in which that should be the case, but it may not be heroic. That's the case. What would we think about the ethics of that insofar it relates to? So, in other words, insofar as it relates to the question of how we should die, what about the question of should we continue to live? Not in the necessarily the question of like meaning and existence, but in the question of from an ethical perspective.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, are we saying that hero? I think this is the other problem. It sounds like we're talking about hero as like some type of permanent feature, where it may be sort of like, it may be like you might have been a hero at this, like you did an action, and then you might have been a hero to this set of people, but then 500 years later, you're a villain to this set of people.
Mhm.
And there's this sort of like
Yeah.
delineation of your action as it is interpreted, and it might be that there might be an incorrect interpretation, but it's nonetheless perceived.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. I think the characterization of hero has to be somewhat relative. And it can't be this like absolute feature of your character.
But it's also not completely relative.
Yeah.
There is, in a sense, like if a society in itself is corrupt and deems my action corrupt, well then is it so it can't just
Is your action corrupt, or is your action still just, but the society being wrong? I get you.
and I think
Like say
that-
the example of slavery or something, where
Yeah.
a lot of people. Yep. Cool bananas.
there seems to be this like grasp of what heroism is that you can only there are some heroes that may be heroes for longer stretches of time than others. I'll say that. How
Mhm.
about that?
Yep.
Like across the set of domains that you are across the set of domains in time that you can sustain, you are more likely to be considered a hero than shorter periods.
And you could actually be a hero without being considered a hero if the rest of the society was, morally bankrupt and corrupted and everything.
Yes,
Yeah.
fair. But
Well,
sorry.
you'll notice that I'm
Like that.
asking mostly questions during this conversation, and that's because I really don't know. For me to come
Yeah.
to any semblance of a conclusion, I'd have to think for weeks, if not months, on this and iron out conjectures. I'm really just in a position of asking questions because that's what I think would be productive at this juncture.
Yeah. I think it's great. I think motivating these questions and then us maybe giving our sort of ideas and letting the audience ask questions and ideas. Like the Guild isn't
Mhm.
meant to give answers; it's meant to motivate questions.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay,
And,
so go ahead.
No, I was just sort of agreeing and nodding, and yeah, this has been a very effective and well used time, paper, and stuff. People's on this show, we've actually managed to keep it very on topic, and I managed to actually get something that could end up being something as a formula later on. Maybe.
I'm tempted to like do a screen share and try to map out what I think. But to be honest, Cody, I would prefer that I wait and like really think it out for weeks and then do it, just because number one, I may, in the process of like defining it one way, think, well, maybe there's a better way to define it. Maybe, I think it would be a less productive use of our time for now. Any of you guys want to present what you think from what we've discussed? A conjecture you would submit as to how we could piece these things together?
Piecing it together and just throwing it in your face.
Come on, guys. Learn some Legos.
Oh, damn it.
Okay. In which case, that's fine. How about this then? We've talked a lot insofar contextually as it relates to a consequentialist theory. However, we've not really touched on, say, a categorical imperative, a Kantian perspective, or, say, a virtue theory perspective. So how would a virtuous person die? Specifically, insofar as virtue theory pertaining to, like, I guess, Plato's account or Socrates. I don't know. It's not clear who's the speaker in the Republic, but
in Socrates' case, it would be thinking of philosophy would be the way that he would die in his virtuous mind.
Oh yeah, that is how Socrates died. He was just like, I'm sticking to this truth even though you don't like it, and
exactly.
I'm gonna die. He was put to death for quote unquote
corrupting the youth.
Corrupting the youth.
Yes, and remember he had a story about him drowning his student. Not actually drowning, but putting his head under the water. The student comes up to him and says, I want to learn about philosophy. And he's like, do you really? And he's like, yes. How badly? He's like, as badly as you can imagine. And then he puts his head under the water, and then he pulls him up after like 30 seconds, says, what were you thinking about? He's like, air. And he's like, until you were thinking about philosophy, you cannot be my student. So he was pretty hardcore with the thinking about the philosophy until the end of time.
I don't know
if it's actually virtuous, but nonetheless, that's how he lived.
I do want to address this comment really quick. Of all these terms, so
hang on. Yep.
Go ahead.
Got a question.
I think there's a distinction between the potential nebulous understanding I have associated with something and the demonstration of that thing to be subjective. And I think, logically speaking, it is very hard actually to demonstrate that something is subjective. Because it seems that if you demonstrate logically that it is, you may very well fail to make your point.
Yeah.
So that does not necessarily therefore follow. The difficulty in defining terms, because this is not, I want to make something clear. People who don't have a lot of experience in higher math, this problem is not unique to philosophy. When you get down to the nitty-gritty of, be it foundations of set theory, be it axioms of how the universe works, you really run into a similar bevy of problems. And it's not clear if it's a linguistic problem. I don't pretend to understand what is going on, if anything. But I just want to be clear that I don't know if it's sufficient for us to argue that I don't even know if what we're discussing is subjective, because I am not convinced that our inability to concretize it yet is evidence that it would be. Because there could exist a set of things that are. So what I mean is, like, sometimes if you consider like an equation like y equals x squared, right? There are two and only two x for any x that can plug in to that who have the same magnitude but have the same output in numeric value. So negative and positive 2 can be squared to 4. And so in some logical systems, you can have multiple non-contradictory inputs, or in some logical systems, you can actually have what seem contradictory in a binary system, but they're not because it's a ternary system. But anyway, you can have n inputs potentially in an n-dimensional truth system that are consistent with that system. We can't fundamentally prove the system, but the point is, this brings up a possible distinction between plurality, not in the sense of like dualism per se, and subjectivity. And I've noticed that they're often conflated. It is not enough that we can have multiple differing perspectives on something, e.g. reference frames in physics, that it be quote unquote subjective. I don't know if those things are the same. And I fear that they are often conflated, as is the notion of something being nebulous, not intrinsically, but perhaps insofar as our understanding of it is concerned. And so, I think that, it's therefore not immediately obvious to me that we are unable to extrapolate from these conversations anything potentially substantive.
Well, I think the subjective comment is, like, at one level clearly correct. It's hard to know how to interpret any set of data. There's a near infinite number of interpretations. But what happens is that, like with the cup thing we're talking about, it's sort of like we have functionalized what this is to where our definition is, in a sense, could be subjective. This could be anything. It could be a fucking wheel on a tire. But the degree to which it's useful as the definition is the constraint to which it can be subjective. Because if you use this as a car's wheel, it's going to break, and you're going to have to get another one and get another one and get another one and keep doing that. And you could say, well, it's my subjective interpretation that this is a fucking wheel of a car. And, like, it could very well be at any point that you want it to. But how useful is it to interpret it in that sense? I could interpret that me putting my hand on a stove is fine for as long as I want. Because, hey, it's me. I don't give a shit. Like, I'll burn my hand. But, like, the point to which I keep doing it and, like, ruin my whole body and die is like, well, how good of an interpretation was that? We have these constraints that make some interpretations less viable than others. And this is where the problem of total relativism comes in, because there are constraints that make some interpretations less viable than others. And to me, all we have is the viability of interpretation.
I feel like, yeah, I'm in, I don't know if I would say complete, but I'm in agreement with Jordan. I think that this objective, subjective distinction, I think that it's useful in certain contexts. So when we're talking about something that needs to be classified as objective or subjective, but when applying it to just like really the universe of things as it is, I think that's when the usefulness of the concept starts to break down. And I think the only reason really to even make the distinction in the first place is so that it aids us in our understanding, or it plays some sort of, like Jordan said, some functional role. And if it's just, I think that even in cases where we don't know whether or not it's subjective or not, or objective, whatever, I think that what matters is not so much whether it is, as a matter of fact, objective or subjective, but like the usefulness that we can get out of it by considering it as such. And even like for everything, you know, all words and all concepts, they're all defined by our own experience. Like we couldn't have concepts of anything if we didn't base them on our experience anyways. But the point is that, you know, we have intersubjectivity and we can talk about these in a useful and productive way.
Yeah, I think there's clearly a question of like the pragmatism associated with functional classification, and insofar as it pertains to the use of language, I agree. To be clear, I don't know. I just think
well,
if I was being precise, I would use far less English, you know. But then I don't think it would be a conversation as much.
I was going to say, if you're being far precise, you wouldn't use English at all. You just talk about.
I don't know. But I
Hang on.
I know. Back on topic, I think that the question of how a virtuous entity would die interests me, because I don't know if part of being in a state of eudaimonia or a eudaimonic state would entail a set of possible deaths or ways of dying.
Oh, and by the way, when we were talking about is it objective or is it subjective or whatever like that, or is it purely just subjective or is it purely just subjective, whatever, it's got to be at least an element of objectivity if we're going to credit the idea that someone could be a hero in a different time because they were rebelling against their society and they were going against slaves or something like that, or whatever the heck it was. And if so those were principles that seem more objective, because we can look at them now and see them as
No,
being.
fair. Duncan. Well, Duncan, even to that point, even more succinctly, like to say that all things are subjective is an objective claim, and so you can't even get out of the. If you say all things are subjective, you've already fucked yourself over, so you can't make that happen.
I'll remember that later.
What I'm trying to say is I don't even know what it means to say something is subjective.
Yeah,
So I don't see how any
I'm writing down objective as a subjective claim just so I like the sound of.
But I don't see how they're even because I don't know what they are. I don't even know if they have a negation relationship such that you can put them together or not. Depending on what system you're applying them in, I just don't know. As is often the case, I have more questions than answers. So I have nothing really intelligent to say insofar as the question of what subjective and objective things are, particularly insofar as how that may relate or may not relate to this conversation. But
related to Chris, do us a favor. Relate our functional, a little bit pragmatic approach to where you would take that.
Okay, well then, where I would take that is that I don't see how you could successfully the intuition behind subjective, right? Yep. I don't see how you can formalize and concretize what a subjective thing would be. I don't see how you can define a membership function for determining a subjective thing.
Yeah.
It's hard.
That to me sees the opposite direction. It seems to me that the more precise you get, the seemingly I don't see how you can determine a membership function.
I see.
Classify something as subjective.
I see. Yeah.
Because then how is it? Because then you're saying that it's not in the set of objective things, but you haven't defined adequately how that can be the case.
Yeah. I like that.
I don't
understanding that.
But that may not be an issue of logic. It may be a constraint of language, and that's a potential concern. Some things can be true, but we can't necessarily write them propositionally as being true without some potential concern. For example, I could say I'm lying, and if it's a true statement, we could be in a potential problem of whether or not I'm being honest by being a liar. There are issues with reference, but also in the assertion of propositions where I say I'm unsure about everything, but it better not be the case that I need to know something about myself that I'm unsure of everything, because I'm making a statement perhaps about myself. And so it's not clear whether or not I can not know everything, or whether I can simply not assert that I don't know everything, even when I don't. So sometimes it may be a problem of language. I don't know, but back to the question of death, insofar as it pertains to it's all right. But all right, so let's I guess the virtue theory application seems. I'm guessing maybe Jordan, Duncan, you guys aren't comfortable enough to discuss virtue theory, so maybe we can move on to a deontological framework.
Get into the virtue theory a bit more. I've read briefly about it, but I'm not very well versed, so go for it.
Yeah, give it a shot.
You want me to take that, Brielle, or do you want to take it? And I'm fine with either one.
Give it a shot, man.
I will try and say it. So basically, the idea behind virtue theory is not. So the idea behind virtue theory, as compared to consequentialist or deontological approaches to ethics, is that the goodness of a thing does not depend on the action like it does in consequentialism, but rather on the person performing that action. So morality bottoms down not to acting in the right way or acting in the wrong way, but more so being a good person or a virtuous person versus being a vicious person. And then the actions that come from that are just supposed to, almost as a second thought, just supposed to classify neatly into that. So a virtuous person only acts in virtuous ways, and a vicious person only acts in vicious ways. So virtue theory is more centered around the person performing the action rather than the consequences or the implications of the action.
Okay. Well, I feel like if I can, I feel like I can see where this is going to go. We're going to go down the path of what it means to be virtuous. We're going to try to define it. We're not going to get to anything.
We'll try to table that because that's usually what occurs in our discussions. It makes it it makes it very difficult for this guild for us to be like streamlined and efficient.
That's why I'm taking notes nowadays.
but I tell you what we can do is giving again the concession to the poking of the stick at the nebulous understanding I believe I have pertaining to what it would be to be virtuous. Can we ask what being virtuous would imply about how would a virtuous entity die? And that's not to say that there is one and only one way, of course, per se.
I have to bow out of this one because like I don't really understand like what it even means to be virtuous. It just seems a little circular. Like a virtuous person is a person that acts virtuous, and it's like, but we're not talking about consequences, and we're just talking about if they're a virtuous person. Like, and this is like a non-starter for me.
Well, all right. So what is meant by that is to be that thing, which is not the same as to act that way, right? So you can be a psychopath and do the right thing, per se.
Sure,
maybe, I don't know, depending on how you define the right thing. And so it's really about whether or not your intentions and thoughts, what you are, aligns with what is done, per se. But I admit, it's not clear where the difference between what you are and what you have done necessarily exists.
The way I see it is that the virtuous people sort of focus more on the intent and awareness of the person, whereas the consequential people are more concerned about the outcome sort of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so maybe we'll move on to a deontological perspective then, because it is a difficult question because, as you say,
I don't know what virtuous is. I mean, I know what it means, but I don't know. Who knows what it is?
I was rather thinking like perhaps we could start from Plato's position of like the three-part soul, and ask if reason was the governing facility of an individual's psyche, for example. What would that imply about how such an entity would die? But we can move on, if you guys want, to a Kantian perspective, say, of like a categorical imperative, for example. We could ask, what ways could we try to universalize dying such that there wouldn't be catastrophe? But the potential conundrum there is that death is sometimes, by some people, already seen as a catastrophe. Not always, but sometimes. And so we proceed very carefully at our peril insofar as that is concerned.
Well, so I think that there is a lot more to be said in terms of a Kantian analysis of death, and Kant actually has some really interesting things to say about suicide. But just in terms of from a virtue theory standpoint, I don't know that there's that much to say, because what it means to be virtuous, and Jordan has kind of made the point, is it really is kind of a circle, and at least that's how Aristotle, who is one of the like main virtue theory people, actually defines it. Is he says that all of the virtues kind of just come about together. You either have all of them or you don't have any of them, and they just kind of rise in you. So it is kind of circular in that sense. Well, I don't know if circular is the right thing, but it is kind of confusing. But the way that a virtuous person, or the way that Plato would say it, somebody with reason or rationality in charge, is really just somebody who reacts the right way in a given situation. So a virtuous person dying, we would probably have to look at like each specific situation to see how somebody would react to it. Like maybe like sheer panic would not be the way to go if you've like lived a full life already, but sheer panic might totally be appropriate in a case where you're like drowning, So it just depends. But I think there's a lot more to say when we talk about it from like a deontological, like human rights approach to death.
So the reason in case anyone was wondering why I started with then the virtuous position, I wanted to, from that, motivate a question of, could we perhaps try to be virtuous as a way of affirming the probability of our dying well? So in other words, is being virtuous a protective mechanism for dying well. And that's the direction I was going from the virtue theory perspective.
Oh,
That's where that was leading. But if people,
Yeah,
you know,
okay.
if Duncan and Jordan, you know, if you guys aren't comfortable or familiar enough discussing virtue theory, then we can just go on to, you know, a deontological perspective.
well, I think there is something to say about the possibility of the intent of the person. It's hard to define. It's hard to define any of the things surrounding it, but I think there is something there in the way of, like Brielle was pointing out, like if you're drowning, like, and you're panicking, or if someone has a gun to your head, like there's a lot of scenarios in which it's like, well, there is this individual level, but in what sense is that, like, how are we deciding that doing it at that point is virtuous? Like there is this sort of collective agreement on when that thing is, and so it seems to be there are some.
So there are some complex mathematical techniques in proofing, such as back and forth induction.
Yeah.
That basically what I'm saying is sometimes the determinacy of membership doesn't have to be in the way that we often imagine, with a chronology that we imagine it having. And so what I mean by that is sometimes the seeming circularity of a structure isn't necessarily a problem. It's just very different. Some things exist biconditionally with each other. And so it makes determinacy very difficult, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily, you know, a non sequitur conceptually. But, you know, Jordan, I claim that you don't get virtue theory because you're not a virtuous person. I'm kidding. But you know, yes, you know, it is kind of a funny joke, right? Could a non-virtuous person not get virtue theory? I don't know. I don't know. But if someone says I'm confused, like when people look at them, you know, and you know, okay, well, we know that person's not virtuous. I don't know, but I'm kidding. But insofar as virtue theory is concerned, I think that's really maybe what's going on here. Is the relationship is just structured in a way that's difficult, as you say, to make a classification in the way that we normally would, which is usually through an implication of if P then Q. You know, so
back to death.
Yeah.
So you want, but that's where I was going with that, was really asking if we could be virtuous as an insurance policy for dying well.
Yes.
And deontologically speaking, I'm interested in looking, say, at the Kantian perspective, which, you know, I find
In what perspective?
deontological. So a subset of deontological ethics is Immanuel Kant's, or Kant, I don't know the enunciation, theory in which he defines a categorical imperative. And it's basically doing a maxim that you could universalize within a defined system that wouldn't end in some kind of cataclysm, for example, is one of the axioms, but not the only axiom of Immanuel Kant's theory. And so if we imagine, I guess the question is, are there ways to die that we could apply such a presupposition to?
Well, so there are 3 different interpretations of the categorical imperative. So Kant's moral theory rests on this central claim that says, basically, and this is oversimplified, but basically it says, don't act in ways that you would not be okay with other people acting in. And so that is the central tenet of his moral theory. But Kant also claims that there are different ways to think of this tenet. And so he calls them different formulations of this central rule, which he calls the categorical imperative. So one formulation, and I think this is the one that is probably most applicable to this conversation about death and how we should die, is called the formula of humanity. And basically it says that we ought not treat human life as a mere means, but always as an end in itself. And so that means that we can't treat human life as merely instrumental. We have to respect it for itself. And supposedly, according to Kant, lots of people debate this, but that idea that we should treat human life as an end in itself is equivalent in the sense that like it has the same, like it'll say the same things for things that we can universalize. So these are two supposedly equivalent statements, at least according to Kant. But I think it's the formula of humanity that's most applicable here. So one thing that we might say is that in whatever way that we ought to die, it should be a death that honors the sanctity of human life. So Kant thinks that committing suicide because, you know, some like things are going bad for you, that would be an immoral way to die, because that's an instance of treating life as an end in itself, or as a mere means, because you're just using the end of your life as a means to end suffering. And Kant thinks that that's bad. So similarly, things like voluntary euthanasia for a chronic illness may be bad. Killing yourself so your family can get your life insurance money would be bad. So Kant thinks that really, I think a lot of death is amoral in the sense that, you know, it's hard to put a moral spin on it because it's such a natural phenomena. But in cases where it's not a natural phenomena and it does kind of treat life as like almost a tool that we can use rather than something valuable in itself, I think that's where Kant would say that we're going wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a well said summary. And you know, I struggle with discussing Kantian ethics because it's like, I don't know many things that if everybody did them, just at least in terms of efficiency, wouldn't end in disaster. Just in principle of how the exponential rise in costs in proportion to diminishing returns factors in. And so I don't know if the problem is whether or not that's bad or whether or not the mathematics of that will often just work out to where it doesn't seem, you know, and when I say do the same thing, I mean at the same time in the same place, right? I usually don't use the word the same because logically that's not really equivalent to equivalency. I would say we do equivalent things because sameness may not be the same or equivalent, shall we say, logically. So one question I'd have then for Kant is, can we imagine a situation where you must kill yourself, right? But in doing so, you save the life of another. And let's just contrive it so that the only way to save this person's life is killing yourself. So there's food and you have to ration it. If you both ration it, you'll both likely starve. But if you starve yourself, which is, I mean, I don't know how we would define suicide, but if that constitutes a type of suicide, would that therefore be immoral of you to do, to allow this person to live? Because it seems to me that in that instance, you're either both killing yourself or one of you is killing yourself effectively, maybe not categorically. And so maybe he would just shake his head and say neither of those are applicable, you know, because it's not really correct to try to critique a theory necessarily by appealing to a domain of instantiations outside of its, you know, domain of applicability. So I don't know if what I've said is not necessarily, you know, applicable, but it is. What do you guys think? Would such an instance perhaps warrant concern insofar as death is concerned and its morality?
Yeah, well, if you kill yourself to preserve like the sanctity of life, in a sense, where that's the hero thing we're talking about, is that if on Kant's view, if I kill myself for like selfish reasons, it's bad. If I kill myself for reasons that would be I'm sorry, I forgot you said, Brielle. You were saying something like
respecting the sanctity of life.
Yes. Sorry, my brain zapped. So if I disneyly respected the sanctity of life through my sacrifice, that's why we have heroic figures. You know?
Well, right, but what I'm pointing out is it seems we have a potential issue here because it seems that it's not clear whose life we're valuing, and what I'm pointing out is it's
why would you like give the other person their the life so that they could live and
'Cause
at
it's
your cost of your own,
obviously not-
or why would you do it at the cost of, like, why would you
Yeah,
live
yeah.
and cost of, there is no right answer almost.
Well, I
Yeah.
don't know about that. It's not insalvageable because you could say, well, there's at least some life. I mean, it's not insalvageable, but all I'm saying is I don't know. That's it's a question.
It's like you had to start taking it into a whole bunch of factors, and like back in the old days, we just used to say women and children first, and that was how we used to deal with it, and that's quite a good system. But
That's a great.
it definitely worked out for the women and children. That's
That's where maybe some of the virtue theory comes in, because there's a moral intuition on what it is to preserve the sanctity of life, like the women and children intuition. You know, that's a really interesting one.
And it's one that's been going throughout history for a long time too. So
yeah, and like
there's probably a lot to it.
We have managed to maintain a viewing audience throughout this entire broadcast. That's pretty high. We've got 6 on YouTube and 6 others from Facebook. So we've had 12 consistently, which is considerably high in terms of our live feed.
You guys need to go do something else.
Now we've got 7 on YouTube. But so I'm thinking we'll end in about 10 minutes. But to wrap this up, because we've gone on now for about an hour, 55 minutes, and so in maybe 10 more minutes. But to wrap this up, my question would be this: being that we've considered multiple ethical theories from which to assess how we should die, and some of them may or may not be in a position to contradict what others would have us conclude. What are the thoughts about those potential conflicts insofar as they pertain to the question? Is it because it's not necessarily a problem, right? Because maybe they're defined on different domains, etc. But does that raise any potential concerns? And then lastly, suppose that we could axiomatize the theory of ethics to concretize sufficiently the question and answer it. Why should we care?
Yeah.
Because the theories don't tell us whether we should care. Like if I had an ethical theory that I could prove was the theory, and I could point to Jordan and just say, Jordan, you're evil, maybe such a theory doesn't even have that as an applicable concept. But if it did, if I could say, Jordan, you're the worst kind, you're the, and he just shrugs,
Yep.
like, okay, it's like, why should we care?
Yeah, that's.
I think we should care because it relates to right back to the start when I was talking about the many deaths. So how we live our life is how we also end in a way. If we live virtuous, we go the virtuous route. So that way people will remember us as not being total, insert any word that you want to put in there. And they might actually remember us fondly. And
so Duncan, it sounds like you need the Ring of Gyges then.
The Ring of Gyges. Yep.
So the idea is to appear moral and heroic, right?
It's not to appear moral; it's to be so that people remember you well, and actually like that you leave a legacy that people can then actually build on.
I'm just trolling you.
But yeah. But yeah, I get what you mean. It's hard. I've got a lot of new things to add to the whole list of stuff of this. Can a heroic deed be done without intent? Oh God, what the hell? I'm throwing it to someone else. Have a second. I'll come back to this. I've got too many pieces of paper.
Duncan, I like it. It's romantic, but I think it's not deep enough. There has to be something like, because I can say, well, I don't care about leaving a legacy. Like, I'm a horrible person. Like, Chris is right. Like, I don't give a shit.
That's you. I'm saying. I did not mean to say that's you, as in that's who you are.
Oh, yes, you did. Yes, you did. There'll be no doubt about that.
No, but I mean, that's for you to choose. It's like choosing your religion or something. I ain't going to choose your religion for you. That's for you to do.
But it seems like the degree to which I would like to keep being a bad person is also predicated on the amount that I can iterate that strategy. And so in a sense, I also have to be somewhat of a good person to keep being a bad person if I would like to continue to be bad.
Okay, maybe I didn't concretize what I meant. What I'm saying is this: suppose you die badly, whether in an ethical sense or in the sense that we discussed experientially. Who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why should you care if you die badly? Is my question. And I think it's more appropriate and more potentially difficult to answer in the ethical sense. The experiential case of like, I don't want to suffer. Maybe there's something there.
That's easy to answer. Yeah.
I don't know if any of these are easy, but in the case of ethics, I find the question of why should I care if I die badly in the ethical context a difficult question.
Yes. No, that's the suffering part. Like that. Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to concretize in a way, but it's like trying to explain one's moral compass in 20 seconds go. No, it's really, really hard to do. But and like if you don't know what a moral compass is, it's going to take a long time for me to explain it to you. So like it's a part of me who wants to take care of my children. Okay, so here's an idea of dying badly, right? My family is in trouble, and I could die with them, or I could die and they get saved, right? That is for me both a moral imperative for me to make sure that I do that, and also for my genes and everything like that, for my lineage. I got to make sure that my lineage continues as well. But it's hard to actually say why my moral compass ticks the way that it does, other than a long ass video.
I don't know what he means by reflexive extensive. That's transitivity is what I think the term you're looking for there, but the transitive property. But in any case, that's an interesting query. I'm not sure, but all I'm asking is just on the individual, on the you level. I mean, because that alone is a difficult question, but then inferring from that question consequence, like, I don't know. What do you think, Braille? Why should we care about whether we die well?
I think we don't have to care about whether or not we die well. I think it has to do with whether or not there are people that stand to be harmed or benefited from our death, and that might just be that person is us, right? So there's this big debate about whether or not we can be harmed after death, maybe by like having our memory defamed, or is that a word? Yeah, like shit over. Am I allowed to cuss in these?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I love that you asked just then.
I'll throw one into here. Fuck it. There you go. We'll do it live.
I love the quote. I love the reference.
But so it might be maybe that we devoted our life to a project that ended up being worthless or something. So we could be harmed in that sense. So if you do believe that you can be harmed after you die, if that's true, then obviously there are self-interested reasons to making sure that you die well, because you don't want to incur that posthumous harm. But if you don't believe that posthumous harm is possible, in the sense that like there's just no possible way that you can be harmed after you're dead, because there needs to be a subject and you are no longer a subject because you're dead, then you might have reason to want to die well for the people that care about you, that are remaining on Earth, assuming that, people die with other people caring about them. And so you might want to die well for the sake of those that you cared about when you were alive. Because it might make accepting your death easier on them, because it might save them from a bunch of ridicule. I'm sure that when Trump dies, oh God, I shouldn't get political. Sorry. And
you shouldn't get my hopes up.
But like, it's just like if you die and you're a bad person, there are people that are going to celebrate your death, which is going to make it very difficult for the people that you love to accept your loss or that loss. And so you might care just for other people. But if there's, if you don't care about your own death and you die not knowing anybody, like you die a hermit, then I really don't think that you do have good reason to care about how you die.
So here's a question, and perhaps then another potential strength for virtue theory. Hey there, is
ask him what he thinks about all this.
Hey Dave.
Would therefore we'd like to say that an advantage perhaps to being a virtuous person is that you have that incentive. A virtuous person doesn't need to be told that.
Yeah, they'll do it on their own.
But
they don't need any like lineage or other of those people's things to do it. They do it on their own back.
let me say, doesn't necessarily need to be told that.
No.
You know, I don't know, but because it seems to me the problem, of course, we would have with each of the reasons Brielle gave, which he's probably aware of, is that I could go, but why would they care about that, right? And we can just go on and on with this game of, well, why should we? And not why in the sense of what is a reason, but why for whatever reason you give. So it seems that we require a system where we have some kind of incentivation that is like a network of incentives that we're aware of that seem to imply a conflict that orientates our behavior or informs us if we're aware of those. Maybe it's not even on a conscious level. I don't know. But it seems that we almost require initial inputs to the system for the question to be well formed. We have to assume a basis of interests that exist before we can ask the question, because otherwise it's not clear.
And this is one of the reasons why, like, I have this problem with what to do with tackling religion and stuff like that, is because some of those people who may not be virtuous people, they may not have people to worry about looking after them when they go on, and they might be a little bit not so nice people or whatever. When they believe in the religion, and then they've got God looking after them, and God's there, and now he's that person that's looking, and all of a sudden they've got him to live for, and to, you know what I mean? So even in the absence of all other people, they are. I'm not necessarily saying that it works, but this is saying that this is how it seems to try to work. Is that people then will have God be a surrogate for that person who comes in and, like, say I've got no family. If I die in a bad way, who gives a damn? Well, God would give a damn if God exists, right?
Yeah,
and
I don't know.
Yeah,
I hear what you're saying.
I think that that's a good preliminary answer to Christopher's question of, like, why should we care simpliciter? You know, is because human beings have the capacity to create value. Like, we can just create it for ourselves. And insofar as there are humans who have this capacity of creating value, you know, an aspect of value is necessarily that it matters. And so we should care about why we die, because it matters.
I intuitively feel that, and I feel like you know, I'm almost irrationally optimistic, but I worry that insofar as, like, the potential for people to have differing states of incentivation, I don't know. You know, some people, I mean, I've met some people that want to argue there's no point to anything, but then I ask them, you know, okay, why don't you tell me an explanation for why you think this? And then I ask them, why did you do that? Yeah. What was the purpose behind that? You know, I'm not exactly a complete nihilist per se, but I don't pretend to be able to sunder it necessarily either. I don't know, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it seems to me like maybe the question isn't well formed, because it may be that we need an initial input to the system. You know, because I don't know if all entities even have that as an applicable question, even if they're sentient, that could be applied to them. You know, maybe some things could be conscious, but there's no incentive there. You know, there's no. It's difficult for me to imagine, but maybe there's something that is self-aware, but it really doesn't care what's happening around it. It could see a rock hurtling towards it in space and be completely indifferent to whether or not it's going to die, how it's going to die, what's going to occur. I don't know. You know, so maybe the question, therefore, is not well formed, and that it needs to be concretized and specified to an adequate domain of discourse. All right. Well, you guys have any other closing remarks before we conclude this video?
Jesus is Lord.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. It's been real fun.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, you've been great.
It has been great.
All right.
Yeah, good talk.
I'm gonna close the broadcast now.